Hi Internet! Welcome to the Gredtroyan YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I decided to release 16 videos ranking the Final Fantasy games in a variety of categories. Each game has their strengths and weaknesses, so I thought it would be a fun way to compare and contrast the games. These lists are just my personal opinion, trying to balance objectivity and personal preference, and likely failing to satisfy anybody. So, if you disagree with my ranking, which you probably do, let me know your ranking of the subject in the comments below. For this ranking, I'm going to be judging each game in the purely subjective matter of art design. How much do I like looking at the game? Do I like the color choices, the artistic direction of the environments, the designs of the characters? Is the aesthetic and general direction pleasing to me? There's very little way to even be the slightest bit objective about a list like this one. So this is really all about what tickles my fancy, and you'll see what art styles I generally prefer in the context of the series. For this ranking, I will not be factoring in the expansion packs for the MMOs. I will consider remakes and remasters, but I'll try to keep their influence generally minimal. Alright, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get on to the ranking. Number 16, Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII is often praised for having some of the most impressive visuals of any game on the PlayStation 2. The background graphics are far more complex than any game in the series that came before it. However, a good chunk of these backgrounds are rather dull and repetitive in terms of color palette. I hope you like muted browns because you're going to see a lot of them. I'm pretty neutral on the heavy inspiration the game's visuals have from the Star Wars prequels in terms of technological design. I didn't hate the visual direction of the prequel movies, even if I wasn't a fan of the films. In terms of character design, 12 feels like a significant step down from the previous single-player entry, Final Fantasy X. While Fran's character design is obviously more eccentric, most of the designs feel too restrained to come off as interesting. I love Balthier as a character, but he's incredibly boring in terms of design. In addition, the trade-off from more complex background graphics meant that the character graphics had to be less complex than 10's character graphics, and sadly I think it shows. In particular, the lack of whites in the eyes compared to 10 makes it look like a step was taken backward in visuals, not forward. You can argue it's an artistic choice to mute the whites of the characters' eyes, but I think it just looks terrible. A lot of the visual design feels more like a Western RPG than a JRPG, and Western RPGs I generally find to have bland and generic design. I know a lot of people really love the look of 12, but it's an art style that's simply not for me. Number 15, Final Fantasy I. There's a lot of charm to the art direction of Final Fantasy I. The world is full of bright colors and bursting with charm and personality. It's simple and may feel generic in comparison to other games in the series, but there is still a sense of vibrancy and character thanks to the excellent pixel art in each version of the game. It's an incredibly endearing art style. The character designs are fantastic. They're striking and iconic. The designs for the Black Mage, Red Mage, and White Mage have endured for over 4 decades for a reason. They're simply that good. Even the fighter, with his red hair and red armor, feels iconic. The villain designs are solid as well, but the designs for Garland and Chaos are truly spectacular. While Garland is striking in his simplicity, Chaos is something wholly unique and distinct that feels quite unlike anything else in the series, and to have something that complex and original this early on in the series is a testament to the brilliant design. There might not be too much here in comparison to other entries, but the quality simply cannot be denied. While some of it may feel a little generic, there's more than enough striking visuals and iconic visual motifs that began in this game to have it easily rank above Final Fantasy XII in terms of art design, at least for me. Number 14, Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II built on the foundation of the first game with its literal use and modification of assets in the original NES build. However, because the strong foundation of the original game was already laid, that gave the developers the ability to improve upon it, and I find that they were largely successful. 2 may be lacking a design as striking as the trio of mages from the original game, but the art design of the individual party members is fantastic. I love what Amano did with each character, and while I like the NES original, I absolutely adore the look of the PSP version. It's my favorite version of the game visually. The character sprites look fantastic and showcase how well designed the characters are. The aesthetic of the world is darker and moodier than the first, which fits the tone of the game perfectly, but also feels like a logical visual successor to the first entry, and accomplishing both feats at the same time is very impressive. Final Fantasy II also gave us the first chocobos in the series, and it's hard to imagine a Final Fantasy game without the iconic yellow birds. Their mere presence is something that immediately bolsters the visual treat of a Final Fantasy game. The game's primary antagonist, Emperor Mateus, has a fantastic design that translates well between all versions of the game. While the Furion of the NES version looks largely different from the Furion of the PSP version, the Emperor always looks like the Emperor. The Final Fantasy series is full of effeminate, cocky characters who wield immense power, and the archetype of the design really began with Emperor Mateus and his David Bowie-esque appearance. Everything about him exudes confidence and strength, despite his more thin frame. He's just really excellent visually, and said visuals perfectly complement him and his role in the story. While the main character designs may not be quite as iconic as later entries on the list, the overall package is spectacular. Final Fantasy II has incredible art design no matter which version of the game you play. Number 13, Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III continues the visual upswing of the early days of the Final Fantasy series, where each entry looked better than the last. One would think this is an obvious goal in terms of video game design, to make each entry look superior to the one preceding it, but given the vastly different artistic directions the series would take, this ended up not always being the case. However, for the first 3 games in this series, this was a clear linear evolution in style, and it was progressively improving. 3's character classes were delightfully designed. Classic designs from the first game returned, alongside fresh and dynamic job designs that would become iconic in their own right. The childlike appearance of the Onion Knight, starting class in the 2D versions of the game, made the player seem like a weak child, and that fantastic evolution into the more adult-looking jobs offered the same power fantasy of the DC superhero Shazam, but with even greater impact because the player was in control of the power fantasy, and it's all thanks to that great design choice. The environments and locations are far more striking than those of the previous 2 games, showcasing far more vibrancy in life, and the more eccentric choices are indicative of the strong personality of later games in the series. The world truly feels like a Final Fantasy world thanks to the map design. In addition, the main villains of the game, Xand and the Cloud of Darkness, are incredibly well-designed characters. While the villain designs for the first 3 games are actually all fairly competitive, Final Fantasy III also introduced us to the Moogle, arguably one of the best designed mascots in gaming, and Fat Chocobos, 2 classic staples of the franchise. There's a bit of controversy in regards to the 3D remake of the game and whether or not the visuals are a good look for it. Personally, I actually love the 3D art style, as I think it fits the narrative and atmosphere of 3 incredibly well, offering a new dimension to the abstractions of the NES's more basic visuals. The addition of newly designed player characters, whose designs I find generally appealing, makes this transition to 3D more acceptable, as it feels like an alternate take on 3 as opposed to just an upscaling. So in that way, 3 allows you different flavors of how you want to experience the game. You can think of the original as vanilla, the 3D remake as strawberry, and the pixel remaster as chocolate. Each offers something different, but across all 3 versions I think 3 is a very appealing game in terms of art direction. Number 12, Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XI was a definite step down in visual design from its stunningly gorgeous mainline predecessor. The games had wildly different goals in terms of what they set out to do in terms of environments, which meant different utilization of graphical resources. Final Fantasy X focused on more linear environments with fixed camera angles, which led to less resources on screen at once, and higher quality visuals. 11, on the other hand, focused on massive and wide open areas with the camera freely controlled by the player, so the focus was using more resources of a lower quality. Because of this, when you compare the games side by side, most would say Final Fantasy XI looks worse than the game that came before it. Even purely in an art direction level, taking aside graphical limitations, 11 focuses a lot more on browns and grays. 11's focus on massively large areas leads to a lot of big, empty space. In many ways, a lot of the early areas in 11 feel barren and vacant, even with you encountering enemies along your travels. There's a naturalistic charm to a lot of the locations. One reviewer said that if Final Fantasy XIV is a theme park, then Final Fantasy XI is a natural state park, and I definitely see where they come from with that sentiment. While the environments can be a little off-putting initially, you can quickly find yourself able to appreciate what the designers were going for. You'll soon find yourself appreciating the design of places like Winders and the Valkorn Dunes, and before you know it, the environments will begin to feel like home. The different races in Final Fantasy XI were all designed by different artists with vastly different art styles. The idea behind different character designers having their styles blend together was to make the world of Final Fantasy XI feel more dynamic and real, to emphasize the theme of this being a world where people from different backgrounds come together, much like the real-life players who join in the adventure together. Humans, elves, and story NPCs were designed by series veteran Tetsuya Nomura. Mithra, Galka, and player outfits were designed by Nobuyoshi Mihara, and the designs for the Taratara race and NPCs were done by Tame Kisanuke. I actually find the different styles blend together really nicely. While I've always been a fan of Nomura's visuals, it's the design of the Taratara race in particular that I find to be one of the most appealing of all the artistic choices in the game. What can I say? I like cute things and they're pretty darn cute. And given the large number of players I see choosing to play Tarataru, it seems I'm not alone in the sentiment of this being one of the more distinct and pleasant parts of 11's design. The chibi nature of the Tarataru design offers a choice to the player as an almost stand-in for the more super deformed sprites of the NES and SNES era. If one wants a character with that kind of visual ratio running around the map, or if one prefers the more standard human proportions that 8 and 10 had moved the series toward, you had the option of the taller races. The blending of old and new could have been a disastrous mismatch, but it ends up working surprisingly well. 11's design is similar to 9's in a way. Both can be off-putting at first because of how different the general artistic direction is compared to its immediate predecessor, but once you begin to become accustomed to the style, it quickly becomes endearing. Beyond that, the design of 11, despite how different it is from so much of what came before it, still has hints of the Sakaguchi Squaresoft-era magic infused into the look of the world and the characters. And despite being an MMO, that magic exists in the game to this day. If I was factoring in the expansion packs, I would likely rank 11 a little higher on this list. The devs managed to get more and more creative with environmental design as the game progressed through the years, and some of the locations they ended up making are some of the most visually striking areas in the entire Final Fantasy series, and yet they still maintain a lot of the design elements of base 11. In this way, they managed to vastly improve upon the core fundamental design philosophy of the game's art direction, but also managed to make the new locations feel like they fit within the already established world without being so much more advanced that they feel out of place. It's a delicate but impressive balancing act they managed to pull off. But in general, the limitations of Final Fantasy XI's art direction can be felt in a number of areas, and the compromises that needed to be made can be felt more in 11 than a lot of other games in the series. There's some fantastic art design in Final Fantasy XI, but also a few weaknesses, and thus it earns the number 12 spot on this list. Number 11, Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV is a visually beautiful game. The locales are absolutely gorgeous to look at. It's one of the prettiest MMOs ever created. However, as nice as the game looks, remnants of 14 1.0 are still very much a part of the general visual aesthetic of this game. The art design of 14 2.0 had to share a lot of visual cues from 1.0 in terms of world and character design. 14 1.0 was considered to have high graphical fidelity, but in terms of general visual presentation, was focused too much on minute details rather than a distinct design style. The result was, what felt like in many ways, just like a redo of 11 in the same way 5 redid much of 3. Except one could argue the changes to the character races made them less charming and appealing than what came before. The big thing original 14 lacked was a sense of charm, coming off as bland. Not quite as bland as 12, mind you, but leaning more on that end of the spectrum than the vibrancy of other entries. And thus A Realm Reborn, needing to continue a lot of the same visual direction as 1.0 so as not to make the transition too jarring, was binded into a certain style. Yoshi P may have upended the world in terms of lore and the layout of the areas, but he couldn't just get rid of the visual aesthetic of the character designs. And while there were subtle changes to the art style to make it more appealing, it was built from a weaker foundation in the first place. Beyond all that though, I do find 14 to have easily the most ugly and cluttered UI in the series, and the chaos of a mass amount of spells and special moves going off on screen at once is generally unappealing to me, as the overblown nature of it leads to it looking messy rather than cool. There are some genuine flaws with the art direction in my book. That's not to say the art design in A Realm Reborn or 1.0 is necessarily weak as a whole, but rather it's lacking as much personality and uniqueness of other entries, at least in the early stages of the game. But I honestly really like the art style and find it to be generally pleasing. It's just that I think other entries offered either something more distinct or something more interesting. A Realm Reborn is a nice middle-of-the-road Final Fantasy in terms of art direction. Number 10, Final Fantasy V. This is where the bias of being a boomer grandpa comes in. Most fans would argue that Final Fantasy XIV has a far superior visual direction to Final Fantasy V, the latter of which is considered by many to be one of the weaker Final Fantasy games in terms of visual direction. And I get it. I get why this game isn't the most beloved in the series when it comes to visuals. Final Fantasy V has Donkey Kong Country 3 syndrome. It's part of a trilogy of fantastic Super Nintendo games, and like Donkey Kong Country 3, took on a more Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic than the other members of their respective trilogies, while still definitely fitting into the overall design aesthetic of the other two entries. They're both the least popular commercially of their trilogies, and thus have less nostalgia attached to them. However, as a lover of Donkey Kong and Final Fantasy on the Super Nintendo, even the weakest of the trilogy is destined to push my nostalgia triggers up to 11. I adore the SNES-era Final Fantasy art style, and Final Fantasy V is a game that utilizes that art style. A lot of fans don't like the color palette, but I dig the combination of bright colors used throughout the game. It's comforting and inviting, not too aggressive, and makes for a cozy-looking game. The visual direction is bright, colorful, and fun, and this combo of colors gives the game an almost relaxing vibe. The character designs in-game may not be much to write home about, though. While Amano made some very striking concept art for the characters, 5 arguably does some of the worst transition from concept art to sprites, where they look basically nothing alike. It makes sense to a degree, as you would want a bit more bland and generic outfits for the base job so that you don't miss the outfit too much when you hop to another class, but it does make for an oddity when you compare what Bartz and Ferris were supposed to look like versus how they actually end up looking. I'm actually a fan of both versions of both characters, and I think in-game Bartz is actually superior to the Amano design, because it really exemplifies his everyman vibe. However, the Amano design of Ferris wins because it exudes more androgynous pirate captain than the in-game sprite. As mentioned, I'm a fan of the differing aspects of the art design here, including the campy designs of Exdeath and Gilgamesh. The overall look of Final Fantasy V may not be as distinct as the game surrounding it, but it's very pleasant, and it's pleasant enough to secure a spot in the top 10 in this list. Number 9, Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI's art direction is more of a mixed bag for me than the average gamer. Final Fantasy VI visuals are generally considered to be the peak of the Super Nintendo, and pixel art in general. I can certainly understand that perspective. The character designs are absolutely fantastic, perfectly blending Amano style and the charming 16-bit chibi nature of what the games have become known for. In previous games in the series, the character sprites out on the map and field were smaller and less detailed than the battle sprites, but 6 not only improved the quality of the battle sprites, but they made those same larger proportioned battle sprites act as sprites during maps and cutscenes. So, not only are they incredibly detailed recreations, they're consistent across the game, and they're a definite improvement. Like Final Fantasy V, they're also extremely expressive and great at displaying a wide array of emotions. The environments are incredibly detailed, but I find that too much of the game is a bit dark and repetitive in terms of visual presentation, and this only gets worse with the World of Ruin. While I think it makes thematic sense there, the more muted colors in comparison to 5 are a bit less inviting on the eyes. It's all to serve a purpose, to enhance the incredibly unique steampunk setting, which is among the most original in the series. However, I find the darker direction not to be suited to the best strengths of pixel art in general. I think another game with similar level of sprite quality, Chrono Trigger, excels beyond Final Fantasy VI in terms of visuals, in part because of a better usage of color. But again, this is really nitpicking. It's impossible to deny how gorgeous 6 looks. Except in Mode 7. 6 easily has the worst usage of Mode 7 of the 3 SNES Final Fantasy games, and the chocobo segments are just plain ugly. Final Fantasy V is bright but lacking originality, whereas 6 is incredibly original but a little too dark for my taste. Like Goldilocks, neither is just right for my taste, but that's not to say that I don't love them both, and 6 ranks above 5 for a reason. It's impossible to deny the extreme quality of the character sprites in this game. It's Super Nintendo Final Fantasy at its most refined state, and an incredible realization of the creator's goals as they push the hardware to its limits. Final Fantasy VI is a fantastic looking game and worthy of taking the number 9 spot on this list. Number 8. Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV is generally a blending of 2 different art styles. On the one hand, you have the basis for the game, which is the dark and brooding remnants of Nomura's Versus 13. Pretty anime boys wearing black and looking very slick with their fantastical outfits and gorgeous refined cityscapes. Then you have the open world aesthetic of quasi-Americana, full of gas stations, campers, and some Route 66 charm. Both styles are good in their own way, and their strange combination is what helps give 15's art direction a very distinct vibe. Obviously, 15's world is gorgeous. Alticia, purely from a visual standpoint, is one of the greatest cities in the entire series. It's an absolute treat just to walk around the city, take a gondola ride, and then take your boat out on the open ocean. The world of Final Fantasy XV is so beautiful that the act of just driving around in the car and taking in the scenery is one of the most enjoyable parts of the game. It's wonderful to just soak it all in, and you could get lost in the game for hours just exploring its rich beauty. The main character designs are absolutely fantastic. Nomura's art style is arguably the definitive art style of the series, at least to the casual audience. While Amano is often considered the cooler of the 2 artists to appreciate, one can't deny that Nomura knows how to make vibrant and distinct looking characters. The characters are classic Final Fantasy, and perfectly epitomize what fans would expect from the series, and even the characters not designed by Nomura, like Cindy and Arden, feel like Nomura designs, and were clearly crafted with a lot of care to ensure that they fit in. However, 15 is a game of 2 styles. So while you have classic-looking Final Fantasy characters like Noctis, you have far more Western-looking characters like Core. And what's stranger is that Core is a Nomura design, so clearly this blending of East and West is intentional. There are so many characters in this game that really give off a, for lack of a better term, American vibe. There are tons of characters that you'll meet throughout the game that look like grizzled Trump supporters who will shoot you if you walk on their property. And then there's literally just the guy from Lost. I've never even seen Lost, but I know that this is just the dude from Lost. If you're not an anime character in the world of Final Fantasy XV, you're an American. Them's the rules. It's a weird aesthetic for a Final Fantasy game, mainly because of the more Western elements. If you take one look at Noctis and Arden and somebody says, this is Final Fantasy, you'll be likely to agree and say that makes sense for the series that has characters like Squall and Tidus. But then you show those same people the creepy weapon shop owners and ask them, what game series is this? And they might have no idea. The weird combo ends up working better than expected, and I do concede that sometimes the overly Western elements get to be a little much, and some of those elements are unappealing to my taste. However, overall I really like the art direction of 15 and consider it to be one of the best in the series. Number 7. Final Fantasy IX. The first time I saw the art direction of Final Fantasy IX, I, like a lot of other fans of the series who jumped on board with 7 and 8, absolutely hated it. Even fans of the older games in the series who appreciated the return to swords and sorcery weren't a fan of how childlike and quote-unquote kiddie the characters looked after the move towards realism and mature-looking characters the previous 2 entries offered. Among message boards across the internet, there was a general dissatisfaction and a what were they thinking attitude towards the devs. There's not to say that all of the character designs were initially hated, as VIII was able to appropriately stoke the flames of nostalgia, but generally the response was pretty negative initially, at least in the circles I ran in. I was a bit more positive, because while I did like the character design of VIII on a first glance, I also thought that Steiner worked very well for what the game was going for, and could see the merits of his design. To this day, I'm not really sold on Zidane's character design, despite absolutely adoring the character. I'm actually not a big fan of the art design of the Naruto series, despite it being one of my favorite stories ever told. So art direction is not a complete deal breaker for me. So with all of that said, why does 9 rank so high? Well, despite an initial lukewarm impression of the art direction based on looking at promo materials, after about 20 minutes of actually putting in the game and playing it, I was thoroughly charmed. The visual direction of the game becomes endearing fast as you realize the more deformed characters were done to better evoke the era of past Final Fantasy games, but modernizing them to the newer hardware and possibilities that 3D characters offered, mixed of course with the trademark gorgeous pre-rendered backgrounds that the PlayStation Final Fantasy games were famous for. A fantastic subtle example of this is Steiner's habit of jumping when he becomes overly emotional, something that was done by sprite characters in previous games where they had less vivid ways of expressing emotions. Seeing this brought to 3D alongside techniques developed by 7 and 8 felt like a perfect blending in art styles once actually seen in execution. The world and NPCs that inhabit it are absolutely oozing with charm and everything works. Once you lock into the vibe of 9, the visual style becomes an absolute treat. It's endearing and full of charm and character. There is a criticism of 9 that it is merely a rehash of old ideas, which is wrong, but every Final Fantasy game, aside from the original, remixes past ideas from the series to a degree in its visual design. The overall style of the game, however, is very distinct to 9. Yes, it does mix the art styles of the NES, SNES, and PS1 eras, but it also brought a lot of unique designs and art that no other game in the series has replicated, before or since. 9 stands as both a definitive testament of the art of Final Fantasy, while also standing on its own as something completely distinct and unique. It looks like every other game in the series, while also having no other game look like it. Final Fantasy IX is definitive of the series, and also completely stands on its own as a unique visual marvel. Number 6, Final Fantasy IV. I absolutely love the art design of Final Fantasy IV. For me, this is the definitive art style of the Final Fantasy series, at least for the pixel art era. I think the visuals in 4 are incredibly striking and pop. Amano's designs are translated incredibly well to 4's cast, but unlike 6, the general color design is brighter and lively. While the character sprites both in and out of battle lack the detail and precision of 6, they offer plenty of charm in their distinct ways. Battle sprites for 4 ultimately became the basis for the character sprites in 6, and I think the lower detail on the sprites necessitated a stronger usage of color, which ends up leading to a style I prefer more. And while the map sprites are not of the same quality as what would come later on, there's still a charm to them in that they're clearly the same base sprite template as the NES games, but with greater ability for color and detail due to the new hardware. In this way, 4 really bridges the earliest games in the series with what was to come next, and thus it's able to hit the nostalgia of the NES and SNES era at the same time with its visuals, while still having its own identity due to its stark, yet simple environmental design. Mode 7 is utilized brilliantly here. The more subtle application of Mode 7 in compared to the over-the-top usage in 5 and 6 has aged far better in my opinion. The character designs and environmental designs have enough diversity to make everything feel distinct, but enough cohesion and overall vision where everything feels like it fits together perfectly. While I do think the 3D version does stumble mildly in regards to the character designs, as when translated to 3D, the more chibi approach doesn't quite translate as well overall given the narrative and environments, Final Fantasy IV's art direction is still overall a home run. Number 5, Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics is, for me, the peak of character pixel art in the Final Fantasy series. While the game takes place in Ivalice, which in general has a darker and browner color palette compared to most of the Final Fantasy universes, Tactics is able to complement its more earthy tones with enough vibrancy and color to avoid the environments from feeling stale and bland. The game actually ends up being brighter and more colorful in a lot of areas than Final Fantasy XII and 6. In general, I'm not as big on earth tones, but Tactics is able to pull them off by not overly relying upon them and realizing a more generous balance of spectrum is needed for a strong visual presentation. Final Fantasy Tactics was a PlayStation game, but instead of focusing on 3D character models, the developers instead decided to utilize the greater hardware of the PlayStation to further refine and improve upon the pixel art craftsmanship Square had been developing over the years. Because these graphics served more as an evolution than a revolution, they ended up aging beautifully. In addition to the great sprite work, the character art is fantastic, and the cutscenes in the War of the Lions version of the game bring the art to life absolutely perfectly. It's an incredibly unique art style that the series has never really emulated since, which is a shame, because the hand-drawn feeling of the cutscene animation is quite simply stunning and feels like it perfectly complements the in-game visuals as opposed to being a jarring disconnect. Final Fantasy Tactics remains a visually impressive pixel art game to this day and holds up incredibly well under modern scrutiny. It's full of charm and style, and it's easily worthy of the number 5 spot on this list. Number 4, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X has one of the most distinct and unique visual styles in the entire series. It's quite possibly the single most unique entry in terms of art style, and one of the most unique JRPGs ever created in that regard. While most JRPGs tend to focus on Western medieval Europe for their primary artistic inspiration, Final Fantasy X instead focused on East Asia and the islands in the Pacific for their cultural basis, but also warping and changing the inspiration in such a way where the visual style ends up being wholly unique and unlike anything else in real life or in gaming. From the clothes to the architecture, the world of Spirit is a distinctly unique place. Fashion of Spirit is one of the most impressive aspects of the art design, as the different cultures of the world have clothing patterns that are distinct to them, and yet all of them feel like they belong in the same world, despite being different from any one culture in our society. The same approach applies to the buildings and technology of the world, and it's incredible. The world itself has a big focus on water-themed visuals, but there's still plenty of variety and attention to even the smallest details. This is a game where the devs bragged about blades of grass flowing in the wind. Everything in 10 is a treat for the eyes, an absolute brilliant use of color. Beyond that, the character designs are striking and iconic. Each one is memorable and distinct. There is no other game that looks quite like Final Fantasy X, and it is definitely not definitive of the series as a whole in terms of visuals. While it does have Nomura designs, the look of the world is so drastically different from anything else that came before it or since, that it truly stands uniquely on its own, and nothing else in the series comes close to the level of individuality this game has. The art style is unique to X's world and X's world alone, and an amazing achievement worthy of the number 4 spot on this list. Number 3, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII has a lot of haters, but one thing even the haters of 13 generally admit is that Final Fantasy XIII, for all its flaws, is an absolutely gorgeous looking video game, even by the standards of today. It's a PS3 game that still manages to look competitive with games released over a decade later. It's stunningly beautiful. The environments are a feast for the eyes, intricately detailed and full of stunning, vibrant colors. The bland earth tones of 12 are nowhere to be found in 13. All the visuals pop, and the player is consistently looking at one gorgeous set piece after the next. There's never anything ugly or dull on screen. The game is consistently a visual marvel. The character designs, done by Tetsuya Nomura, are striking and distinct as always, but they're also more reserved than some of his previous work. This ends up finding a good balance in terms of design, where some people felt previous designs of his felt overly indulgent, like Lulu's belt obsession and Seymour's hair. In 13, the designs are still distinctly Nomura, but his eccentricities have been scaled back, like a guitar player who knows how to shred, but instead choosing something more tasteful and simple to benefit the material. There's room for both, but I ultimately prefer and appreciate restraint from an artist, and like a refined craftsman knowing when less is more. The result are character designs that don't distract from the overall experience, but rather fit into it perfectly, like a finely tailored suit. It looks good, and it feels good because it looks so good. You might not like the characters in 13 based on their personalities and the way they're written, but there's no denying that they look great, from the outfits to the hairstyles to the distinct faces of each character. They're a fantastic looking cast, and each of them feels both distinct, yet appropriate for the world that they're in. The futuristic setting of 13 is a hair more sci-fi than the likes of 7, 8, and 15, but overall, 13 fits in very well with the sci-fi meets modern times aesthetic of the Final Fantasy games exemplified by Nomura character designs. It's the best looking game on the PS3, one of the best looking video games ever, and easily worthy of the number 3 spot on this list. Number 2, Final Fantasy VII. This is definitely going to cause some controversy. Final Fantasy VII, at the time of its release, was a visual marvel and one of the most cutting-edge graphical powerhouses on consoles at the time of its release. Over time, though, the game's visuals are continually criticized, with most of the ire being drawn towards the characters outside of battling cutscenes. These LEGO characters, as they are often called by fans, are near universally considered to be ugly by not only fans of the series, but game critics and the general public at large. The design choice was an attempt at a compromise between the devs. Some wanted to have the characters with more realistic proportions, like those used in battles and cutscenes, which most generally acknowledge as looking pretty good, especially for the era, and haven't aged that poorly at all. Other devs wanted a more chibi style, like in the NES and SNES Final Fantasy games, and thus the compromise of the LEGO people was created for the map characters. This graphical choice is near universally hated and derided. I like them. I find the LEGO characters to have a lot of personality and charm. They have a great ability to be over-the-top and video gamey when required, which works well for some of the game's campier moments, but they're also able to display enough emotion to make the game's more powerful moments have plenty of dramatic weight. I acknowledge being in the minority on this, but I think these graphics are great. I love how unique and weird they are. I've seen PC mods that replace the in-game characters with more sleek models, but I think these come off as bland and too Western, losing the original Japanese charm in the process. That's not to say I don't understand the desire people had to see the game remade, as I think it does make sense to want some graphical consistency between battle, map, and cutscene, and I will not deny that the battle and cutscene graphics is a far better look for the characters. And I do think Remake generally got the look of the characters right. But I think the fan mods forgot to add any semblance of personality and charm to their graphical mods, opting for overly serious, which is never what Final Fantasy VII was about. It was about being serious, sure, but it was also fun, and the LEGO characters are plenty of fun. I know, I'm in the minority on this, but I like that they offer something unique to Final Fantasy VII, and given that 7 is by far the most popular game in the franchise, they can't be all that bad. What can't be denied is how great the rest of the game looks. This is another game with characters designed by Nomura, and the simple but striking designs translate to battle perfectly. The limitations of understanding new hardware led to a focus on simplicity in the designs, and in my opinion, Nomura is at his best when he utilizes restraint. His style is so focused on big, bold strokes that when he's forced to simplify, the big, bold strokes are further heightened, and thus every party member in 7 has an extremely iconic design. And Sephiroth is easily the most iconic villain in the series, especially in terms of visuals. The pre-rendered backgrounds still look absolutely fantastic. Midgar's sense of atmosphere is unmatched in the series. It truly feels like a dark, moody, fully living and breathing city that completely consumes the player. The wider world outside of Midgar is full of variety and diversity, but it feels fully cohesive in regards to everything else in the game, leading to something incredibly cohesive that continually builds upon its foundation without ever detracting. The blend of sci-fi and modernization originated for the series in this entry, and for many players, this is the definitive aesthetic of Final Fantasy. Not swords and sorcery, but swords and motorcycles. And in my opinion, it looks extremely cool, even to this day. Number 1. Final Fantasy VIII. There is no Final Fantasy game whose visual style I love more than Final Fantasy VIII's. I don't dislike the LEGO characters of 7, but the realistic proportion characters of 8 is what all of us wanted from 7, and they look fantastic in 8. Those characters, along with the improved quality of the pre-rendered backgrounds we fell in love with in 7, is chef's kiss perfection. Overall, the character designs on 8 are definitely weaker and more dated than 7's, as Zell will be eternally trapped in the 90s with his Mike Tyson tattoo and jorts. But as an old-school rock and roll guy, it's hard to find a more appealing-looking protagonist than Squall. Dude dressed in all black wearing a leather jacket and badass boots? Hell yeah. He looks incredible, and is a fantastically cool player avatar in terms of appearance. It's like getting to play as an emo version of Alvin Stardust, which is a reference I'm sure people born after 1970 in territories outside of the United Kingdom totally get. But yeah, the characters are gorgeous looking. The environments are gorgeous looking. It's just so fantastic and pretty to look at. It's basically the 80s hair metal of Final Fantasy. It's flashy, over the top, a little dated, but it's so much fun. There are a lot of things in Final Fantasy VIII I don't like, and the game is a total mess in a number of areas. But when I think of what is an ideal-looking Final Fantasy, my first thought is 8. The modern society meets sci-fi aesthetic, with Nomura designs, with pre-rendered backgrounds, is what Final Fantasy is to me, on a core level, when it comes to visuals. I love the different flavors of Final Fantasy, but this art style triggers the nostalgia buttons and it still looks amazing to this day. It's exactly what we wanted from 7 in terms of presentation, and greatly builds upon the foundation 7 set. While 7 has locations that are ultimately more creative and a far better cast of character designs, the improved presentation of 8's designs is what allows it to win for the best visual presentation in the series. It's my favorite looking Final Fantasy. Thanks for watching this video. Again, these lists are my personal opinion, and I'm definitely curious to see you guys posting your rankings in the comments below. Be sure to do the YouTube things, the liking, the subscribing, etc. And if you like this video, don't forget to check out the other rankings in the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope you find peace and happiness in your life. Cheers!